Hey everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Saša Babič's and Piret and Voolaid's A Sociocultural View of Estonian and Slovenian Proverbs on Alcohol and Drinking. I very much love this article. I think it's a perfect illustration of what Proverbs do. One of their premises is that Proverbs emerge within cultural contexts, and so they are going to use, perhaps as a metaphorical resource, the everyday experiences of a community or a group, or its cultural landscape. So, like John Messenger did this when he was talking about proverbs that's used in Nigerian court systems, referencing, if you have an understanding of the action of animals in the community and in your environment, then you can use the actions of animals in terms of whether they fly alone or so on to express some kind of sentiment about, using that as not simply a metaphor, as a simile, I guess, for how people organize. Not only that, of course, there's not simply that. It's used as cultural moments are not only used as a reference point, they're also a point of discussion. And so what they're talking about, what Saša and Piret are talking about, is drinking itself. Drinking is it's an almost universal phenomenon, and even non-drinking cultures are defined in large part expressly by not drinking. And so the concept of drinking is part of their worldview and their lore. It's something they are abstaining from, and they would still nevertheless have proverbial wisdom about alcohol, but almost entirely seeing it as a negative. What happens in cultures that do drink is nevertheless, it's not a uninhibited acceptance thereof. There's an ambivalency towards it, and there's ambivalency towards when it is appropriate, when it is inappropriate, what its values are, and what its values aren't. And they're summed up, at least as far as Saša and Piret are concerned, they're summed up within that ambivalence is summed up nicely when you look at the store of both Estonian and Slovenian proverbs. And you can look at these both synchronically and diachronically. Those are good terms to bear in mind if you're not familiar with them. Synchronic is basically looking at the same phenomenon as it occurs in different places, but more or less at the same time. It's kind of a temporal snapshot, state-of-the-art understanding. So if you wanted to look how, for example, a parallel cultural phenomenon, if you want to look how Christmas is understood, you could look at Christmas in Eastern Canada, in Central Canada, in North America, in Europe, and so on, and you can see a temporal, on the same temporal playing field of sometime in the 2020s, what Christmas is actually like. Diachronic is how it emerges across time. And so you'd often sort of have that understanding on a more narrow aspect, but over time, as generations proceed, what things remain constant, what things change over time. So diachronic and synchronic are useful modes. Just to put this in context, they're two different field sites and do two different corpuses. One is Estonia. Estonia is a Baltic state. It was one of the Soviet republics. It was one of the very first to declare independence in the Silent Revolution, I believe, is what they called it in Estonia. So it's right across the water from Finland. It is not too far from St. Petersburg, and so it represents one language group and one particular history and a different climate. Slovenia is down on the Adriatic. It is a Balkan state. It's a different language group and a different region. And those regions, a temperate region. And those regions are important because they're going to indicate what kind of alcohol is actually produced there and drunk there. The northern Estonia is much more of a beer and, to a certain extent, vodka culture, and Slovenia is a wine culture. Slovenia is adjacent to Italy and Greece and so on. It's a Mediterranean country, or Adriatic, but on that body of water. and wine producing is part of its industrial economy and its agricultural economy as well. So it is a wine place, and wine is different from beer and different from vodka, and the cultures of drinking are different from beer, different from vodka. Nevertheless, there's going to be remarkably similar attitudes towards them as well. Like many places around the world, we're looking at Europe historically, drinking is reasonably widespread. It is sort of an understood essential part of many festive moments, high holidays. It's certainly part of the Christian tradition in terms of at the Eucharist. We know wine is mentioned in the scriptures, and the scriptures are influential through most of Europe, and definitely so in Slovenia and Estonia. They are. It is expected. It's an expected part of sociability. It's an expected part of hospitality. Significant occasions like anniversaries or grand openings of things or successful business ventures and deals are often marked with alcohol. There are, nevertheless, and that's true in both places, but there are two different attitudes towards drinking. And this is a gross generalization, and they recognize it as a gross generalization, but it also seems to be part of their respective local discussions of self, so their self-perceptions. Estonian drinking is very much part of the Scandinavian process, patterns of drinking, which tends to be sort of more on binging occasions. It's not an everyday occurrence, but when it happens, it is drinking to some form of not necessarily utter excess, but drinking for inebriation purposes. You drink to get drunk and celebratory that way. Slovenian drink culture, again, more focused on wine, and it has to do, it's engaged with food, it's sociability. The idea of drinking every day is not an untoward thought, but it's usually understood in some kind of form of moderation. And that is not, that's probably not unrelated to the idea that whereas beer making, obviously beer making is obviously a cultural production. Viniculture is a much more widespread part of the day-to-day agricultural economy of at least a pre-industrial Slovenia, and so it is grapes understood much more of a crop and for purposes of winemaking, as opposed to the grains of the north, which would be used for beer but used for other things as well. So it isn't necessarily the taboo nature of that might be implicit in terms of the relationship between work and the product of one work is less so in Slovenia as it is up in the north. Unlike many places in North America, European folklorists, I should say, benefit from long history of collecting exercises starting in the 19th century and progressing through the early 20th and, throughout even up to the 21st, but particularly those sort of great moments of nation building and the nationalism of folkloristics that was taking place. I mean, we can lament nationalism within folkloristics, but what it did was encourage these incredibly large resources. And so both Slovenia and Estonia have a remarkably thick archival trove to pull from. And Saša and Piret have done so. Piret is Estonian. Saša is down in Slovenia, Ljubljana. And they are so they have a rich material to draw from, and Europeans love data. They just have so much data that they can they can analyze it that way. They categorize it according to initial categorization according to these 13 themes that were present within a classic of Estonian epidemiological research. Of which they say these categories cover the field of the influence of alcohol on family members and the psychophysical state of a person drinking, the addictiveness of alcohol, as well as positive views of alcohol, the healing effects, the relaxing feeling, and festiveness while celebrating. They then took these categories and sort of we figured them into three overlapping themes, or overlapping concerns might be a better way. One has to do with the national cultures and the social contexts of drinking, the various contexts in which one would find oneself drinking, and how proverbs reflect that for good and ill, or for judgment and acceptance might be better than saying for good or ill. Drinking is a gendered act and its relationship to the family and the home, and then the act of drinking itself, basically in terms of the body and the spirit and the sociability, again, in both times of judgment and times of celebration, the ambivalence that is in place with all them. So they start off with the national culture, and it's good to recognize, and the point that they emphasize about proverbs in general is that not all proverbs within a culture are born entirely within that culture, within sort of an organic folk culture. For one thing, the folk are always borrowing from whatever is available to them. So there is proverbs can emerge from literature and the influence of literature into the day-to-day. Fine art, the same way that in English we'll have proverbs that are fundamentally Shakespearean, like neither a borrower nor a lender be. However much that's, might be a foolish piece of advice because it's Polonius, the father, Laertes' father in Hamlet, Polonius, who's not necessarily meant to be a sensible person. We've abstracted it from that context and have turned that into a proverb. There's proverbs that come from the scripture. Again, there's proverbs that come that are understood international, and then there are proverbs that basically come from advertising. If you look all the way to the contemporary age, new ones emerge. So the thing to do when one's studying proverbial expressions as they circulate within a culture is, yes, answer the question of where they come from, because that is an interesting question. But that is not the question that is really of interest. What is interest is that it has found it to be, that the group has found this particular expression to be useful. So not precisely when and from where it entered into a culture and into the parameleological understanding that the culture that circulates in that culture, but rather why, what does it serve to illustrate within that culture. So as they go forward, for example, the in vino veritas, that's a classic Latin proverb, and so it wasn't included in earlier collections because it wasn't understood as an Estonian one, but it's prevalent and constant, and the basis of variations, what they call anti-proverbs, where a new expression is formed based on the proverb itself, going on the assumption that everyone knows what the proverb is, and therefore will get the referent and get what is being inverted at that particular moment. So the anti-proverb is, there's a lot of, in vodka there lies truth, proverbs in Estonian. But, it wasn't included because it wasn't folk Estonian. But that's an old-fashioned way of looking at it. The fact that it has purchase within the group is one of the things that's present. And we now see English language or translations of English language proverbs entering into world cultures as well, because English functions as a colonial, colonizing language. So it's so the method is always, to look at its use, not necessarily its source, when you're trying to determine what kind of role a particular proverb has. So I like how they divide it into sort of the different drinking contexts and how they relate to the socializing aspect of the culture. So Estonia has one of its main forms of familial and amity socializing is the sauna. So the hot room, people sit around unclothed, get a big sweat, and will then sort of plunge into a cold water, and it's associated both with health, and it's associated also with social health. So it's a collective exercise. Many people will have a sauna in their own home, and you need to have drink there. And the impression from like the woodcuts and is that not simply is it a matter of keeping hydrated in a hot space, but fundamentally it is the sociability as well. So there's a positive good, and a sauna culture is focused on the home and focused on levels of intimacy in all senses of the word, without necessarily having to talk about sort of sexual intimacy per se, but it's something that one does among friends. So it is a social lubricant. There's a number having to do in the Slovenian context, very, very few in the Estonian, but in the Slovenian context, there are many having to do with vineyards and viniculture in general, and the drinking conditions of there, or proverbs that actually have to do, they're basically weather lore proverbs, and they have to do with the winemaking as an activity, as a crop, as something that is of economic concern. So not necessarily about sociability per se, but certainly about how it relates to the day-to-day activities of the group. But then both cultures have proverbs about the tavern. The tavern, which is held up as a place, for one thing, it's a place for drinking and sociability, but that is literally outside of the home. It is. They're not using this language, but it's about the tavern as a third space, which is not simply not at work and not at home, but it is a place where it is outside. It is outside those two spheres, and it seems to be always framed as a negative. Particularly, you can see that in contrast to things like the church, and so. That there are many proverbs in both groups that have to do, in both Slovenia and Estonia, that relate the tavern and the church as two sort of opposing sides. Clearly relates the church to holiness, and relates the tavern either implicitly and sometimes explicitly with the devil. And a hellish kind of place. So the dedicated space, even though every town has a tavern, and that's not simply a statement of historical fact, but a proverb nevertheless. And clearly that indicates some kind of social need and social fabrication. It's always understood as a perilous social thing. And so there is a reality, and there is a standard judgment about that reality, but the standard judgment about that reality does not actually shift the reality. It's not like we all know the taverns are horrible, right? It's like, well, maybe, but we're not doing anything about it. The second grouping is the group having to do with gender and family, and that clearly there's many proverbs that are about how it's prohibited, alcohol is prohibited towards children, with the sort of asterisk next to it in certain Slovenian proverbs, with that southern European idea that if you introduce alcohol in a safe environment to children, obviously in moderation, that will actually forestall drunkenness or becoming a drunkard later in life. But it's really this category of the drunkard. If the tavern is a place where the drunkard exists, the drunkard is now a figure in this, and its relationship both within or absent from the family. How the drunkard kind of is a fundamental problem and a pariah. How the drunkard and the child are often compared to each other as both being drains on the family. I mean, they mention how that this is always sort of, when you make that comparison, it's really unflattering. It's unflattering to the concept of the child, but that they are equally sort of burdensome. They're equally irresponsible, and they're also lucky to be part of a family. So they're lucky that they will have people who take care of them despite being burdensome and irresponsible. And there's clearly a gendered aspect here as well, because men drunkards are bad, but women drunkards are infinitely worse. And that's correlated with concepts of ugliness. So, again, if within traditional culture, the literal and metaphorical value of women is often described in terms of their beauty, drunkenness becomes, at the very least, a metaphorical ugliness, and perhaps even related to a physical ugliness. So it's casting aspersions. The same kind of metaphor of ugly and beautiful would not necessarily be cast upon the male drunkard. Women are in a again, sort of a fascinatingly wonderful way. Women are equated with alcohol itself in terms of leading you into temptation and leading you into making bad decisions and so on. And we could check that for a while. Nevertheless, we are also express a remarkable amount of pity and a remarkable amount of respect for the woman who is married to the drunkard. So, because of the additional burden that is placed on them. And they don't say this too much. I think largely because it's implied without necessarily spelling it out. But the men in these proverbs, as a corpus, are only occasionally defined by their roles as husbands and fathers, whereas women in these proverbs are almost inevitably framed through the lens of wife and mother. So largely having to do with sort of the presumed centrality of the woman in the home and her roles, her values as defined largely by her familial work. So we have the idea that men spend more time in the public sphere, or at least men are permitted to spend more time in the public sphere, and while women are not expected to, and when they do, particularly in forms of like drunkenness and moving away from their domestic sphere, they're doing something untoward. So again, it ties into this public and private tradition that Sandy Ives talks about in terms of the two traditions. I tend to come back to this a lot, but it is a useful lens when one is talking about the gendering of content in terms of attitudes towards drunkenness in Slovenia and Estonia, how much it's related to the expectation of the expectations of work and the expectations of the local economy in its lowercase e, or its oikonomai form, the understanding of the relationship between labor and the household. So I think it's a good thing to remember. They do say something along these lines at one point. Women were the members of the family responsible for taking care of children as well as adult family members in the house. Men were often more providers of food and money and often absent. The family and the surrounding society were more dependent on women and therefore suffered more when a woman was not efficient as regards her expected tasks than when a man did not perform his duties. So, yeah, I mean that is basically summing up. But that ties into goes right back to the male drunkard is bad enough, but the woman drunkard is far worse, largely because since her duties are entirely related and her expectations and her value are entirely related to the domestic sphere, that is sort of subverting those levels of expectations. We're not saying that folklore is fair. We're saying that folklore reflects these attitudes, and then you can see them. And then the third category, the third sort of overlapping concern, has to do with the ambivalence of drinking itself. Because too much alcohol is invariably a bad thing, a lethal thing, that there is not necessarily any excuse for overindulging. And the Proverbs suggest moderation all the time. Nevertheless, it's a cusp. I mean, because knowing that it serves more than merely the good feeling. We'll get back to that. Merely the good feeling of drunkenness and merely the social benefits of social lubrication, but that what it also does is it can be medicinal, and the relationship between alcohol and medicine. It's one of the reasons when alcohol was banned during Prohibition in Canada, there were exemptions for medical treatments because it was still something that a doctor could prescribe. So alcohol was available under those conditions because it still has that cusp of the benefit of it. And you'll find a lot of people who might otherwise define themselves as teetotalers who will use alcohol in home remedies like hot toddies and stuff for colds and flus and the like. So to this day, alcohol is understood as having a potential medicinal aspect of it. So yeah, the idea that if alcohol can't cure you, then what you have is a serious disease. That's a theme that's present in both Estonian and Slovenian folklore. So as much as too much is a bad thing, in moderation, it isn't simply not bad. It is actually a positive good. That there is a benefit to drinking moderately. There is a fundamental benefit to drinking because contentment alone is a positive good. Happiness is a positive good. And if alcohol can bring that, when it's done in moderation, when alcohol can bring that, it is something that should be potentially celebrated. It's certainly one of those things that at least argues against its complete and total eradication in times of prohibition or in states of abstinence per se. It initiates sociability. Having it to offer, having it on hand, being able to cement or reaffirm a relationship with alcohol is understood as a positive good. Knowing that emotions run high with alcohol, it can lead to quarrels, but simultaneously it can also help settle them. So again, this remarkable ambivalence. It can make us make bad decisions. Maybe you've experienced that. And so it is something with all the positives that we've just said, having previously to saying those have talked about its negatives in terms of the drinking to excess. Yeah, it can lead us to make a couple of questionable decisions, not necessarily of dire consequences, but perhaps at least of foolish consequences. It can lead to certain forms of ruination, though. It can lead to exile, it can lead to shame, it can lead to being thought untrustworthy or unpredictable, and it can lead to financial ruin. Nevertheless, it's a valuable thing, a gift from God in many ideas, in many sayings. It is something that this isn't theirs. I mean, this isn't Estonian or Slovenian, but isn't it Benjamin Franklin who said something along the lines of beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy? That said, it's known, addiction is a real thing, and long-term prolonged exposure when it's not in moderation, and as science changes, maybe even when it is in moderation, is known to be lethal. There's a deleterious effect that we know even the most stubborn drinker knows that it is not an entirely healthful practice. But also drinks are not a monolith, that there are some that are understood as more or less sociable, more or less dangerous, more or less prone to introducing quarrels and so on. They are framed as being in slightly different registers. What's more, strength of drink is associated with masculinity in a positive way, in terms of like those sort of happy masculine notions of sort of virility and strength, and in negative ways in terms of prone to anger and violence and so on. So as much as masculinity is kind of an ambivalent category, strong drink becomes an ambivalent category as well. So there's a certain amount of description that's happening in this article, and demonstrating that there is a correlation of general attitudes that are contradictory, attitudes that are going to be contextual. And remember, when we talk about a proverb, although, and that they're quick to point out that a lot of the early collectors merely collected proverbs and were less interested in context. So we don't know precisely when for at least for the classic pre-modern collection exercises, we don't know exactly how it was employed at a given time. All we have are the words themselves. We recognize that a proverb is the corpus of proverbs within a culture are these units of wisdom, these instances of understanding that are understood as containing truths. Meader describes them as concise traditional statements of apparent truths with currency among folk. And Permyakov says they are artistic miniatures in a fixed form that reflect facts derived from real events, which are really nice encapsulations of what a proverb is. Simultaneously, we know, because we've just witnessed them, we know that within a culture there are contradictory proverbs. There's a proverb that promotes the wonderful feelings that one has, the almost heaven-sent joy that can be occasioned by alcohol. And there are the ones that talk about how it is a dire project and something that can lead us to despair and ruination. And collectively, if proverbs sort of reflect the collective understanding, both are going to be true, and one would be used in a particular context. So proverbs are something that exist within a group because they reflect an idea, and then I can use it. Let's move this from what they do collectively. I can use a particular proverb in order to illustrate my particular point on a particular situation. But my particular point is being backed up by and justified by what you know as the collective wisdom. That you know the group tells you this about alcohol. Like, oh, yes. You could counter. We could have a battle of proverbs where you could counter with the contradictory one, and we could proceed accordingly. But when we have a fundamental aspect of our human activities, at least within the Eastern European tradition, arguably within the Pan-European, arguably in international, with large sections cut out from that, but still defined in part by contrast to it. But if a large part of our sociability is defined by alcohol and the prospect of alcohol, nevertheless there is an ambivalence and understanding that it is a dangerous part of this necessary part of sociability, this either or. The notion that there are a whole slew of proverbs about this fundamental human activity, that reflect that ambivalence, that reflect both the joy and the danger, that reflect both the isolation and the sociability, that reflect the real negotiation that we have towards this thing. It's illustrative of something. So it's more than a description. This article, it's more than a description. It's more than a survey, although it doesn't set out to be. It sort of makes a claim of being something of a survey, but it puts it in the sociocultural perspective, and again, serves for our purposes. It's this wonderful illustration of how, over time, however sourced, by reflecting on the topic itself and crystallizing it into delectable, conventional pearls of wisdom that have assonance and consonants and their aesthetic forms themselves. Proverbs always sound good. It's one of the reasons that they retain, is that they are aesthetic moments themselves as well. We have this rich storehouse, we collectively, and then Estonia and Slovenia specifically, with these specific examples, have these rich storehouses of wisdom that we can bring to these moments when we have to make decisions about a thing, about this act of drinking. And I just think that's quite wonderful. All right, I've blathered on a little longer than I intended to, but I just really like Saša and Piret's work, and I just really like this article. So, my name is Ian. We have been reading a sociocultural view of Estonian and Slovenian proverbs on alcohol and drinking. And as ever, my friends, I wish you well, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.